The courthouse was too big. The ceilings stretched high above, swallowing the voices of the people inside, making them sound distant, like echoes in a cave. The girl stood at the entrance, her small fingers tightening around the edge of her dress. The air smelled of polished wood, ink, and something sterile, like a place where important decisions were made, where lives were changed forever. She was only 6 years old, but today she didn't feel like a child. Not when her father was sitting in that courtroom, waiting for a verdict he could never fight on his own. A court officer glanced at her, then looked away, uninterested. No one paid attention to her, a tiny figure in a blue dress and scuffed shoes. She was used to that, being overlooked, being too small to matter. But today, she would matter. She took a deep breath, then stepped forward. The floor was cold beneath her shoes, each step too loud in the silence. Lawyers whispered in hushed tones, judges flipped through thick files, and men in expensive suits exchanged knowing glances. These were people who understood the rules of this place, who knew how to twist them in their favor. She understood nothing about the law, but she knew the truth. Her father was innocent, and no one else was going to say it for him. A hand caught her arm. She flinched. "You lost, sweetheart?" A woman in a navy blue blazer asked. Her voice was gentle but distracted, already shifting her attention to something more important. The girl shook her head. "I'm here for my daddy." That made the woman hesitate. Her gaze flicked toward the courtroom doors, then back down at the child. Before she could say anything else, a voice called from inside. "Next witness." The girl pulled free and walked toward the heavy wooden doors. Her heart pounded, but she didn't stop. Inside, the room was even colder. Rows of strangers filled the seats, their faces unreadable. A tall woman in a black robe sat at the front. Judge Myers. The girl had heard her name before. She looked stern, the kind of person who had never had time for fairy tales or bedtime stories. The judge raised an eyebrow when she saw the child step forward. Someone laughed under their breath. "You've got to be kidding me." The prosecutor, a man with silver hair and sharp eyes, stood with his hands in his pockets. He exchanged a glance with the defense attorney, an exhausted-looking man with papers spilling from his briefcase. "This is highly irregular," the prosecutor said. "She's too young to—" "I can talk," the girl interrupted. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. Judge Myers leaned forward. "And you are?" She swallowed. Her throat was dry. "My name is Riley Carter." The judge's expression didn't change. "And why are you here, Riley?" She turned her head, locking eyes with her father. He sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped together. He looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen him. His knuckles were white from gripping his own wrist, like he was holding himself together with sheer force. She had never seen him cry, but she wondered if he wanted to. She looked back at the judge. "I came to tell the truth." Someone coughed. The prosecutor sighed. "Your Honor, this is—" Judge Myers held up a hand, silencing him. "Let her speak." The girl took a shaky breath. She had practiced this in her head 100 times, but now that she was here, the words tangled. She stared down at her hands, trying to remember. What had her father told her? "If you ever get scared, just tell them what you know. The truth is the truth, no matter how small you are." She lifted her chin. "My daddy didn't do anything wrong." The prosecutor exhaled loudly. "No one is saying he's a bad man, but—" "He didn't steal. He didn't hurt anyone. He was just trying to help." Silence. Judge Myers studied her, fingers steepled under her chin. The prosecutor shifted his weight, clearly annoyed. "Miss Carter, do you even understand what your father is being accused of?" She felt the heat of everyone's eyes on her. A trick question. A trap. Her fingers curled into her dress. She might not understand the law, but she understood what was fair. She took a breath and asked the question that had been burning inside her since the moment they took her father away. "If my daddy had money," she asked, her voice clear, "would he still be in trouble?" The courtroom fell so silent that she could hear the ticking of the clock. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Even the judge looked caught off guard. The prosecutor blinked, mouth opening slightly before shutting again. No one answered, because there was no good answer. Her father let out a shaky breath. The judge tapped a finger against the desk. The sound was quiet, but final. "I believe we need to review this case further." The prosecutor stiffened. "Your Honor?" "That's enough," Judge Myers interrupted. We're taking a recess. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people began to shift in their seats, whispers spreading like wildfire. The girl stood frozen as a court officer approached her father, unlocking his cuffs just enough to let him stand. He looked at her, really looked at her. Then, slowly, he smiled. She ran to him, burying her face in his jacket. "I'm so proud of you, baby," he whispered. She squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the fabric in her fists. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. The courtroom was restless. Whispers rippled through the audience, a quiet storm of disbelief and curiosity. Riley stood at the witness stand, her small hands gripping the wooden railing. The air felt heavy, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Across the room, the prosecutor cleared his throat, regaining his composure. His silver hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his expression carefully composed, but his eyes held something sharp, something that told Riley he wasn't going to let her words shake the case so easily. "Miss Carter," he began, voice smooth but firm, "do you understand what perjury is?" She blinked. The word was unfamiliar, but she could feel the trap beneath it. The prosecutor took a step forward. "It means lying under oath. If you lie in court, there are consequences." A murmur ran through the room. The tension tightened around Riley's chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. "I'm not lying," she said, her voice small but steady. The prosecutor sighed as if he was dealing with a child who had wandered somewhere she didn't belong. "You said your father didn't commit this crime, but the evidence suggests otherwise." He turned to the jury, gesturing with an air of confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand that this young girl loves her father, but love does not change the facts." Riley's fingers curled against the wood. The judge was watching, her gaze unreadable. A part of Riley wanted to run, to let the grown-ups handle this, to let the system decide what was fair and what wasn't. But then she looked at her father. His wrists were still red from the cuffs. His face, worn and tired, held no anger, only the quiet acceptance of a man who had been fighting a battle he knew he couldn't win. Riley swallowed hard. She wouldn't let them take him without a fight. She lifted her chin. "The facts are wrong." A gasp rippled through the audience. The prosecutor's jaw tensed. "And you know that how?" Riley hesitated. She wasn't supposed to say it. Her father had warned her to be careful, told her not to speak out of turn. But this wasn't just about what was allowed. This was about the truth. She took a breath. "Because I saw who really did it." The entire courtroom froze. Even the judge looked taken aback. The prosecutor recovered first. "You? What?" "I saw who did it," Riley repeated, her heart hammering. "The night they arrested my dad, I was there." The whispers exploded into full-blown noise. A gavel slammed against wood. "Order," the judge commanded. The prosecutor turned back to Riley, his composure slipping just slightly. "Miss Carter, are you telling this court that there was another suspect?" Riley nodded, her throat tight. "Yes." The prosecutor hesitated for the briefest second. Then his expression hardened. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Riley opened her mouth, then stopped, because she knew exactly why. She had told someone. She had told the police. Her stomach twisted as the memory crashed over her. The night they took her father away, she had tugged on the officer's sleeve, her tiny voice desperate as she tried to tell him what she saw. And he had knelt down, placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, and whispered, "Don't make trouble, sweetheart. This is the way things are." Riley's fists clenched. She lifted her gaze to the prosecutor, meeting his stare with something she hadn't known she had inside her. "Because no one listened to me." The room went silent again. The judge's expression finally shifted, just slightly but enough. The prosecutor hesitated. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Riley felt the weight of the moment. She was just a child. But right now, she held more power than anyone else in this room. She took another breath. "I can tell you what he looked like. I remember everything." The judge leaned forward, her voice softer now. "You saw someone else at the scene?" Riley nodded. "Yes." The prosecutor's lips parted, but he had no words. Because suddenly, the case wasn't as simple as they had made it seem. The room buzzed with quiet intensity. The jury exchanged glances. The defense attorney, who had been silent for most of the trial, straightened in his seat as if he had just been handed a lifeline. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "I believe we need to examine this further." The prosecutor's hands curled into fists. He wasn't used to losing. But Riley wasn't done. She looked back at him, her voice clear and unwavering. "Are you going to listen to me now?" The judge's gavel struck wood. And for the first time since this trial began, Riley felt like she had changed something. The silence in the courtroom was different now. Before, it had been filled with dismissal, as if Riley's words were nothing more than the innocent ramblings of a child who didn't understand the world. Now it was thick, heavy with a realization that no one wanted to acknowledge. Riley stood at the witness stand, her hands still gripping the wooden railing. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her, burning into her like spotlights on a stage she never wanted to be on. She had said it. She had told them the truth. But now came the hardest part, making them believe her. The prosecutor regained his composure first. His silver hair was immaculate, his suit perfectly pressed, but there was a crack in his confidence now. Riley could see it in the way his jaw clenched just a little too tightly, the way his fingers drummed against the desk. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by a 6-year-old girl. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice controlled but sharp. "You're claiming you saw another suspect the night your father was arrested." Riley didn't hesitate. "Yes." The prosecutor nodded slowly, as if considering. "And yet, you didn't tell anyone until today?" She swallowed. "I did tell someone." He raised an eyebrow. "I told the police." A murmur rippled through the audience. The judge's gaze flickered with something. Curiosity? Concern? Riley couldn't tell. The prosecutor didn't blink. "And yet there's no record of this statement." Riley felt her stomach twist, but she stood her ground. "Because they didn't write it down." The murmurs grew louder. The defense attorney leaned forward for the first time, his eyes sharper than they had been all trial. The prosecutor let out a breath, shaking his head. "Miss Carter, do you understand how serious an accusation like that is?" She nodded. "Yes." He studied her, searching for any sign of hesitation. She gave him none. "Then tell us," he said finally, "who did you see?" The courtroom was suffocatingly still. Riley took a breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The memory of that night was burned into her mind. The way the streetlights flickered, the way the shadows moved, the way she had seen someone who wasn't her father, running from the scene just before the police arrived. She opened her mouth to speak, and the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A uniformed officer rushed inside, whispering something into the ear of another man in a suit. The man, one of the lead detectives, stiffened, his face paling. He nodded once, then turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice strained, "I need to request an immediate recess." The judge frowned. "On what grounds?" The detective hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he turned to the prosecutor and muttered something low enough that only those nearest to them could hear. Riley didn't need to hear the words to know what had just happened. They had found him, the real suspect. Her hands tightened around the railing as the judge's gaze darkened. "Step forward," she ordered. The detective hesitated but obeyed. He cleared his throat. "We just received surveillance footage from a nearby store." He swallowed. "It contradicts our original findings." The gasps were audible now. Riley dared to glance at her father. For the first time in weeks, there was something in his eyes other than exhaustion. Hope. The prosecutor looked like he had just swallowed glass. "Your Honor, this doesn't prove." The judge silenced him with a look. "We will review the footage." Her voice was clipped, firm. "And if this court finds that a mistake was made, we will correct it." Riley barely heard the words. Her heart was pounding too loudly. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about what she had seen. It was about proving that someone had always known. The officer who had ignored her. The detectives who had never looked deeper. The system that had been so eager to put a poor man behind bars that they had never even considered they might be wrong. Her father's hands clenched into fists, not in anger, but in something quieter. Something deeper. Relief. The judge's gavel came down. "Court is in recess." The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping, lawyers scrambling, reporters rushing toward the doors to make their calls. But all Riley could do was turn and run. She didn't care about the cameras flashing or the whispers of strangers. She only cared about one thing. The warmth of her father's arms as they wrapped around her the second she reached him. She buried her face in his chest, his familiar scent of old books and laundry soap wrapping around her like a shield. "You did it, baby," he murmured against her hair. His voice cracked. "You did it?" Riley squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the fabric of his shirt as tightly as she could. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. For the first time in weeks, she felt heard. And for the first time in weeks, she knew. They weren't going to take him away. The courtroom was different when they returned. The tension had shifted, not gone, but altered, as if the weight of an invisible force had finally been recognized. Riley stepped back onto the witness stand, her legs sore from standing for so long, her heart still pounding from the recess. Her father was sitting upright now. He was still in handcuffs, but his posture was different. Hope had straightened his back, had softened the exhaustion in his eyes. For the first time, Riley felt like maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't end the way everyone expected it to. Judge Myers adjusted her glasses, scanning the room. "We have reviewed the new evidence," she said, her voice measured, "and it raises significant concerns about the validity of this case." The prosecutor's face was unreadable, but Riley could see the tension in his jaw. He knew he was losing. A large screen was rolled into place, and the courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the security footage played. It wasn't perfect. The camera angle was grainy, the lighting poor, but it was enough. Enough to see a shadowy figure rushing out of the alleyway. Enough to see that it was someone taller, broader than her father. Enough to see that her father wasn't even in the frame at the time of the crime. The murmurs started almost immediately. The defense attorney, who had spent most of the trial looking defeated, sat up straighter. "Your Honor," he said, his voice suddenly filled with a confidence that had been absent before, "this directly contradicts the prosecution's claim that my client was at the scene. I request an immediate dismissal of all charges." The prosecutor stood quickly. "This footage is inconclusive," he argued, though his voice lacked the same force. "It doesn't definitively identify another suspect." The judge turned to him. "And yet it does provide reasonable doubt." Silence fell over the courtroom. The gavel came down once. "Mr. Carter," Judge Myers said, her gaze shifting to Riley's father, "you are hereby exonerated of all charges." For a moment, there was no sound, no reaction. Then the handcuffs were removed. Riley's father flexed his wrists, staring down at the marks left behind, as if he couldn't believe they were gone. Then his eyes found hers. She didn't remember moving. 1 second, she was on the stand. The next, she was running. Her father caught her midair, lifting her up as if she weighed nothing at all. She felt his chest rise and fall, his arms wrapped tightly around her, his breath uneven. "You did it, baby girl," he whispered, his voice raw. "You saved me." She buried her face in his shoulder, gripping him as tightly as she could. The courtroom around them was chaos. Reporters rushing toward the exit, spectators still murmuring, lawyers hurriedly gathering their things. But none of that mattered. Her father was free, she had won. Outside the courthouse, the air smelled different. It wasn't heavy with fear anymore. It wasn't thick with uncertainty. Riley took a deep breath, her small hands still gripping her father's tightly as they stepped into the crowd. Reporters shouted questions, microphones and cameras shoved in their direction. "Riley, how does it feel knowing you changed everything?" She hesitated. She had never wanted attention, never cared for cameras or headlines. But she knew why they were here, because today a 6-year-old girl had made the world listen. She turned to her father. He squeezed her hand, nodding slightly. Riley looked back at the cameras. "It shouldn't take a little girl to prove the truth," she said simply. The reporters fell silent for a moment, and then clicks, flashes, voices overlapping. Her father led her away, through the crowd, past the noise. As they walked, Riley glanced up at him. "What happens now?" Her father exhaled slowly. "We go home," she nodded. "Home." For the first time in a long time, it felt real. Her words didn't just free her father, they started a conversation. One that needed to be heard. "What do you think? Is justice truly blind, or does it take a fight to make it fair?" Comment below and share the story if you believe the truth should never be ignored. The sky outside the courthouse was a muted gray, the air thick with the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Riley walked beside her father, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his hand as they stepped onto the pavement. The moment should have felt lighter, like something out of a dream. He was free. But there was no celebration, no grand applause, just a crowd of people waiting to hear what she had to say. Reporters pushed microphones toward her, cameras flashing in rapid succession, their voices blended into a wall of noise. "Riley, how did you know to speak up? What do you say to those who doubted you? Do you think justice was served today?" She didn't know how to answer that last question. Her father gently pulled her closer, shielding her from the chaos. His grip was warm, solid, but she could feel the tension in his arm. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He had spent his life trying not to be noticed, working long hours to keep their small apartment, never asking for more than what they needed. Now the whole world was looking at them. A woman with a notepad stepped forward, her voice softer than the rest. "Riley, if you hadn't spoken today, what do you think would have happened?" That was the question that made her stop, because she knew the answer. She could still hear the officer's voice from that night, whispering to her like a secret she was supposed to keep. This is the way things are. She thought about how easy it would have been to believe that. To let the world tell her what was fair and what wasn't. Riley lifted her head. "If I hadn't spoken, my dad would still be in jail." The murmurs grew louder. She wasn't sure if they were surprised or uncomfortable. Maybe both. Her father knelt beside her, his voice low. "We don't have to stay out here, baby. We can go home." Home. She wanted that. She wanted to be back in their small kitchen, where the air smelled like coffee and the window let in just enough light to warm the floor in the mornings. She wanted to sit on their old couch and watch cartoons, pretend that today had never happened. But she also knew that wasn't possible. She looked up at him. "Would you still be in trouble if we were rich?" Her father's breath hitched. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he reached up, brushing a loose curl behind her ear. "Yeah, baby," he said quietly. "I think it would have been different." She already knew that, but hearing him say it out loud made her stomach twist. She turned back toward the reporters, her heart pounding. It shouldn't be like that. The whispers turned to silence. One of the cameramen adjusted his lens. A microphone inched closer. She clenched her hands into fists, suddenly angry. "My dad didn't do anything wrong, but we didn't have money, so nobody cared. Nobody listened." Someone in the crowd cleared their throat. The tension was shifting again, but not like before. This time, people weren't ignoring her. They were listening. She took a breath. "If my dad had been rich, none of this would have happened. But it shouldn't take money to get justice." Her father squeezed her hand. She looked up at him, expecting him to tell her that was enough, that she didn't have to keep talking. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded. The air felt heavier now. Not because of fear, but because of something bigger. Something that wouldn't disappear just because the trial was over. A reporter took a step forward. "Riley, what do you think should change?" She didn't know the answer to that. She was just a kid. But she knew what she wanted. "I think people should listen," she said simply, "even when it's not easy." Her father let out a slow breath. "Come on, baby," he murmured, leading her away from the crowd. "Let's go home." As they walked, she could still hear the voices behind her, the murmurs of people repeating her words. She didn't know if anything would change. But at least now, they couldn't pretend they didn't hear her. Riley's story is proof that sometimes the smallest voices are the hardest to ignore. But why does it take a child to ask the questions that should already have answers? Do you think justice should depend on wealth? Should the truth be enough? Comment below and share this story if you believe in fairness for everyone, not just the privileged. The streets felt different as they walked away from the courthouse. The air was thick with the weight of everything that had happened, but it wasn't just exhaustion pressing down on Riley's small shoulders. It was something else, something heavier. People were still staring. Some whispered, others just watched, their eyes unreadable. She didn't know what they were thinking. Maybe they saw her as just a little girl who had asked a big question. Or maybe they were wondering how a child had managed to make the world stop and listen, even for just a moment. Her father's grip on her hand was tight, steady, the kind of grip that said, "I will never let go again." They passed a group of reporters still clustered near the courthouse steps, their voices overlapping as they spoke into cameras. The case that took an unexpected turn today. A 6-year-old girl at the center of it all. Will this trial change the way we see justice? Riley lowered her gaze, pressing closer to her father's side. She didn't care about the cameras. She didn't care about the headlines. She just wanted to go home. But as they reached the bus stop, a voice called out. "Excuse me, Miss Carter?" She turned, hesitating. A woman stood a few feet away, holding the hand of a little boy who looked about Riley's age. His clothes were too big for him, his shoes scuffed and worn. The woman's eyes were tired, but kind. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said softly. Riley blinked. "For what?" The woman smiled, but it was a sad kind of smile. For asking the question nobody else would. She glanced down at her son, then back at Riley's father. "Some of us don't have the courage to speak up, but maybe now, because of you, people will start listening." Riley didn't know what to say. She had fought for her father. She had spoken because she had no other choice. But now, standing in front of this woman and her son, she realized it had never been just about her father. Her dad nodded at the woman. "We all deserve to be heard," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The woman gave a small nod before leading her son away. The bus arrived, its brakes hissing as the doors swung open. Riley and her father stepped on, moving toward the back, away from the few passengers already seated. She sat by the window, her fingers tracing invisible patterns against the glass. Outside, the city moved on. People hurried down sidewalks, cars honked in the distance. Life continued, as if nothing had changed. But Riley knew something had. Her father exhaled slowly. "You okay, baby girl?" She turned toward him. "Yeah." He studied her for a moment, then gave a small smile. "You did something big today." Riley looked down at her hands. They still felt small. She didn't feel like she had done anything big. She thought about what the woman had said, about how some people didn't have the courage to speak up. Her voice had been so small in that courtroom, yet somehow it had been loud enough to shake an entire system. She thought about all the other kids like her, the ones whose parents had been taken away, who had been told they didn't matter because they weren't rich, because they didn't have power. "Dad?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Yeah, baby?" Her fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. "What if nothing changes?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Change doesn't happen all at once," he said. "But you did something no one else could. You made them see." She nodded, but the weight in her chest didn't disappear, because she wasn't sure seeing was enough. The bus rumbled forward, the city blurring past. Riley leaned her head against the window, watching as the courthouse faded into the distance. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew she wouldn't stop asking questions, because someone had to. Riley's voice didn't just save her father, it started a movement. But why should a child have to be the one to ask the questions that adults ignore? Do you think justice is truly fair, or does it only listen to those with power? Comment below and share this story if you believe every voice deserves to be heard. The apartment was exactly how they had left it. The same pile of unopened mail sat on the counter. The same half-empty cereal box leaned against the fridge. The same worn couch, the same dim lighting, everything was the same. But Riley wasn't. She stepped inside and felt the weight of the past few weeks settle over her shoulders, like an old coat she couldn't take off. She had fought. She had won. Her father was home, so why did it still feel like something was missing? Her dad shut the door behind them, locking it out of habit. He sighed, glancing around like he too was trying to remember what normal was supposed to feel like. He set his keys down on the table, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had left faint marks. "You hungry, baby girl?" She shook her head. He nodded, as if he expected that. "You want to talk about it?" She hesitated. "I don't know." He sat on the couch, patting the space beside him. She curled up next to him, pulling her knees to her chest. The quiet between them stretched, heavy but comfortable. "I keep thinking about that woman," she said finally. "The one with the little boy." Her father tilted his head, waiting. "She said not everyone can speak up," Riley continued. "That maybe now people will listen." Her dad exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. "She's right," Riley frowned. "But what if they don't?" Her dad was silent for a moment. Then he rested a hand on her back, rubbing slow circles like he used to when she was little. "Sometimes the world don't change just because we want it to," he said. "But that don't mean we stop trying." She stared at the floor. "It's not fair." "No, it ain't. His voice was calm, steady, but you did something no one else could. She looked up at him. What if it's not enough? Her father studied her for a long moment. Then we keep going. Riley pressed her lips together. She didn't like that answer. She wanted something solid, something certain. She wanted to know that because she had spoken, things would be different. But the truth was, she didn't know. The truth was, nothing about this was certain. A knock at the door made them both jump. Her father tensed immediately, instinctively positioning himself in front of her. After weeks of fear, of being treated like a criminal, the reaction was automatic. He took a cautious step forward, looking through the peephole. Then his shoulders relaxed. "It's okay," he murmured, opening the door. A woman stood there dressed in a simple black coat, holding a folder against her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes flickered with something. Hesitation? Guilt? "Mr. Carter," she said. "May I come in?" Her father hesitated. Then, with a nod, he stepped aside. Riley watched as the woman entered, glancing around the small apartment like she was seeing something she hadn't expected. "I'm with the district attorney's office," she said, her tone careful. "I wanted to speak with you about your case." Riley felt her stomach drop. It wasn't over. Her father crossed his arms. "I thought the charges were dropped." "They were," the woman confirmed, "but there's something you should know." She set the folder on the table and opened it, revealing a stack of papers. "The officer who originally arrested you, he ignored critical evidence." She paused, including Riley's statement. Riley's chest tightened, the woman's voice softened. "It wasn't just a mistake, it was intentional." Her father's jaw tightened. "And," she exhaled, "and he's being investigated." Silence filled the room. For the first time, Riley saw something shift in her father's expression. Not relief, not anger. Just understanding. "They were never going to listen," he murmured. "Not until they had no choice." Riley swallowed hard. "What happens now?" The woman hesitated. "That depends," she admitted. "The department won't want this getting out, but if you wanted to take legal action..." "No." Riley turned to her father, surprised. "But we got what we needed," he said gently. "We're home." Riley wanted to argue, she wanted to fight. But she also knew her father, and she knew what he was really saying. Some battles were won in court. Others weren't. The woman nodded, closing the folder. "If you change your mind, you have my number." She left without another word. The door shut, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Riley turned to her father. "If they were never going to listen, why did it work?" He smiled just slightly. "Because you made them." The words settled in her chest, warm and certain. She had made them listen. And maybe that was enough, for now. Riley's story wasn't just about one case. It was about a system that only listens when it's forced to. So why should justice be something you have to fight for? Do you think the truth should be enough, or will it always take a battle? Comment below and share this story if you believe every voice deserves to be heard. The days after the trial felt strange. Riley expected things to go back to normal. She thought that after everything, life would settle into the way it used to be. Waking up to the smell of her father's coffee, watching the light stretch through the cracked blinds in the kitchen, falling asleep to the hum of the city outside. But nothing felt the same. People whispered when she walked past them on the way to school. Some kids stared at her like she was someone different now. Like the girl who stood in court wasn't the same one who used to sit in the back of the classroom doodling in the margins of her notebook. Even her teacher looked at her differently. "Riley, can I talk to you for a moment?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her backpack. The other kids shuffled out of the room, yet their voices fading into the hallway. Her teacher, Mrs. Ellis, offered a small smile, the kind adults gave when they weren't sure how to talk to kids about hard things. "How are you holding up?" Riley shrugged. "Okay." Mrs. Ellis nodded slowly, like she didn't quite believe her. "I saw you on the news." She paused. "You were very brave." Riley looked down at her shoes. She didn't feel brave. "I just said what I had to," she muttered. Mrs. Ellis studied her for a moment. "Sometimes that's the bravest thing of all." Riley didn't know how to respond to that. She shifted her weight, gripping the strap of her bag a little tighter. Her teacher hesitated. "If you ever need anything, you know you can talk to me, right?" Riley nodded. "Yeah." But she didn't believe that either. Because the truth was, Grown-ups only listened when they had to. She left the classroom, pushing through the doors and stepping into the sunlight. The air felt warm against her skin, but she couldn't shake the cold that had settled deep in her chest. The world was watching now. People cared now. But what about the next kid? The next father? Would they listen then? That night, as she sat on the couch flipping absently through channels, her father sighed from the kitchen. "You don't have to keep thinking about it, baby girl." She glanced at him. "How do you stop?" He didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands on a dish towel, leaning against the counter. "You don't," he admitted, "but you figure out how to live with it." Riley frowned. "That's not fair." Her father let out a soft chuckle. "No, it ain't." She turned back to the TV, but she wasn't really watching. Her mind was spinning. It wasn't enough. Speaking up had saved her father. But what about the ones who didn't have a voice? A thought settled in the back of her mind. Something small but sharp. Something that wouldn't leave her alone. What if she could make people listen before it was too late? Her fingers curled into fists. Maybe she couldn't change everything. Maybe she was just one kid. But she had already proven that sometimes one voice was enough. She reached for her notebook, flipping to a blank page. She didn't know what she was going to write yet, but she knew one thing. She wasn't done speaking. Not yet. Riley's story may be over, but the fight for justice isn't. How many people go unheard just because no one is willing to listen? Do you believe one voice can make a difference? Comment below and share this story if you believe every story deserves to be told. The pencil moved slowly across the page, the tip pressing so hard against the notebook that it nearly tore through. Riley didn't know how to say what she wanted, but she knew she had to say something. She sat on the floor of the living room, the dim glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Her father had gone to bed hours ago, but she couldn't sleep, not when the weight of everything still sat heavy on her chest. The trial was over. The cameras had disappeared. The world had moved on, but she hadn't. The words swirled in her head, half-formed, tangled up in the frustration that refused to leave her alone. The same frustration that had been there since she asked that question in the courtroom. Since she realized that justice wasn't about the truth, it was about who had the power to make people listen. She tapped the pencil against the page, staring at the blank space beneath the first sentence she had managed to write. How many people are sitting in a cell right now just because no one believed them? Her stomach twisted. She wasn't supposed to be thinking about this. She was supposed to be happy. Her dad was home. She had won. But deep down, she knew the truth. Winning one battle didn't mean the war was over. A gust of wind rattled the window, and she shivered, pulling the sleeves of her sweatshirt over her hands. The room felt too quiet, like the silence was pressing in on her, reminding her that the world outside was still unfair, still broken. She flipped the page and started again. What if we told their stories? The words felt right. She sat up straighter, her fingers tightening around the pencil. That was it. That was what had been clawing at her for days. She couldn't fix everything. She couldn't undo what had happened to her father or to the families who didn't get the second chance that they had. But she could do something. She could make people listen. A surge of energy rushed through her, drowning out the exhaustion that had been weighing her down. She grabbed her tablet from the couch, opening a blank document. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitation creeping in. Who was going to care what a kid had to say? But then she remembered the way the courtroom had fallen silent when she had spoken. She remembered the look in her father's eyes when the judge announced he was free. People had listened once. Maybe they would listen again. She started typing. My name is Riley Carter. A few weeks ago I asked a question that no one wanted to answer. I asked if my father would still be in trouble if he had money. The truth is, we already knew the answer, but no one wanted to say it out loud. The words poured out of her, faster than she could think. She didn't stop to edit or second guess. I didn't speak because I was brave. I spoke because I had no choice. And now I'm speaking again, because there are people who still don't have a voice. Her heart pounded as she read the words back. This was it. This was what she needed to do. Her hands shook as she hit publish. The screen blinked, confirming the post had gone live. It wasn't much, just a single post, floating in a sea of stories, drowning in all the noise of the world. But it was a start. She closed the tablet and curled up on the couch, exhaustion finally settling into her bones. Outside, the city stretched on, endless and uncaring. But somewhere, someone was going to read her words, and maybe, just maybe, they would listen. Riley's story didn't end in the courtroom. She knew that justice wasn't just about one case, it was about the voices that never get heard. So what happens now? Do you believe that one voice can spark change? Comment below and share this story if you believe every story deserves to be told.